So the title of this video is a little misleading because like I don't love Yukio Mishima. I definitely disagree with quite a few things he says and does. I feel like before I talk about Yukio Mishima, I should add some context of who he was and how he died. He was born in like 1925, lived through World War II, and then he died in 1970. He was very right. He was an ultranationalist of types and Shintoist, and he basically like led a coup on the Japanese government and then like killed himself by seppuku. So I feel like before I say anything about Mishima, I should add that context to who he was. He was, philosopher, writer, playwright, poet, all that jazz. And I recently listened to the audiobooks for Sun and Steel and Notes on the Mind for Young Samurai, or Lectures on the Mind for Young Samurai, or just Notes for Young Samurai. It was just like, I've heard a bunch of different translations of that title. But it's really interesting because I don't agree with a lot of what he says, but there's so much that he says that's very intuitive if you're a young man growing up in the West. Like I grew up with a pretty traditionally masculine upbringing, and so I read a lot of the stuff that he writes, and I'm thinking, like, wow, like this is very much the kind of masculinity I grew up with, and a lot of the stuff I grew up to be innate, I grew up to think was innately true in some form or another. Like for example, a person's external, being is an extension of their internal world of sorts. That's an idea I heard a lot growing up. You look at a fat person and you think, they're greedy, they're slovenly, they're very rotund, their spirit is greedy and sickly. You look at a weak and frail person and you think, that person is probably weak-willed and probably very, what's the term, undisciplined, or nihilistic maybe, or stuff like that. And this is something that Yukio Mishima talks about a lot in Sun and Steel, is he talks about like, it's like, like a person's internal, or a person's external world ought to be a reflection of their internal world of sorts. That was an idea I heard growing up a lot, especially in a military family. And then, another idea he talks about a lot that I kind of grew up to be innately, or I kind of grew up around, was those who mock hero worship are never heroes themselves. The only people who mock hero worship are usually people who are frail and not to be considered of a heroic stature. And he points out that there must be some correlation there. And a lot of this stuff is stuff I grew up with. Talks about a lot of stuff in that book. Very poetic language, which is so ironic because he talks about being an anti-intellectual. He talks about not letting your imagination run free and the sort of trap of imagination. And it's so ironic. He feels like an anti-intellectual. Like, that's the only way I can put it. Very well written. Very, very well written, regardless of how I feel about any of the ideas. Very well written. Notes for a Young Samurai is very interesting because he talks a lot about different, like cultural norms and stuff like that. And one of the interesting things he points out is about how a lot of previous generations of men were built on shame. Which is such a weirdly self-aware and woke kind of moment for someone like Mishima to take. He comments on how, like, when his son was born, he called up his father, and his father was very dismissive, about his first grandson being born. And, Mishima points out, like, the reason for this is because it's the same reason why men wouldn't walk alongside their women. And when their children were being born, they were supposed to be acting aloof, while being worried inside. Or they would go out to drink while their kid was being born, and they'd go out and celebrate with friends. And it's like, that's how men would operate, because it was shame. And I find that to be overwhelmingly true, where men of older generations were built on shame. They were built on this sort of cultural stigmata around being effeminate, you know? And I find that to be the truth that I've come into later in life. Another thing that kind of resonated with me was he just like talks a lot about masculinity, about things that seem to be true from a masculine viewpoint. You know, like, again, hero worship, that's one big one. He talks about how, like, you know, sex for young people, it tends to be like, you know, especially young men tend to be like a very scary experience, but we're kind of expected to flow into it. You know, how men are creatures of culture in the same way that women are. You know, we're very much like, you know, like the shame thing, where we are shamed into our positions as much as women are shamed into their positions. You know, Yukio Mishima, I think if you read his books with no outside context, you would probably come away as a very right-wing individual. I think that I try to avoid using any sort of buzzword ever in my day-to-day life, but like, I think his ideas kind of lend to a fascistic worldview. I think the idea, you can't judge people by their external appearance. You can't judge people based on if you think they look stupid or weak or greedy or anything like that. I think that kind of idea is just downstream of something like physiognomy. So, you know, I think he definitely isn't a role model. You know, I don't think he should be a role model, but he is filling a niche for young men where it's like, you know, if I'm a young man, I am a young man, but like if I was a younger man, you know, and I was more impressionable and I didn't already have an established worldview, I could see myself reading this and basing my entire personality around it, for better or worse. I think if you are interested in politics and culture and sociology and psychology and gender and things like that, I think you should read Yukio Mishima, because you will come away with a very important understanding of gender and masculinity. Good stuff. Great writing. Like, any sort of politics aside, just very flowery, pretty, compelling writing. So definitely give it a read, especially if you're into philosophy. My ramen's done. Have a good rest of your day. One last thing before I sit down to eat. To anybody who follows Yukio Mishima's works and personally believes in his worldview, I'm really curious on what your opinion on powerlifters would be, because powerlifters are usually big fat guys, but they're just enormously powerful. You know, if somebody's external is a sign of their internal, and this is sort of kind of making a judgment based on their athleticism, would you look at powerlifters as a valid form of athleticism? Interesting food for thought.